Hey everyone, welcome to chapter 14 with our flexibility training for our seventh edition of the Nasm CPT training certification program. So we're going to knock out flexibility training, which, you know, with that sequence of everything, we were really talking about how chapter 13 kind of lumped everything together. Chapter 14 really is going to work on getting everything in the right order. All right, so that we can start to really say, okay, flexibility, then we're going to move into cardio, then we're going to move into core balance. Okay, so we're going to keep progressing through each one of these. So as we go through, just remember, it's each step of your training program based on that integrated training model that we had talked about. Okay, so there's your learning objectives down there on the bottom. So let's just get right into it. So flexibility, you know, probably one of the most underappreciated of them all. All right. We have to make sure that proper flexibility can lead to everything: proper muscular endurance, proper strengthening, proper, you know, it doesn't really matter what it is. It's just the simple fact that we can continuously, change if our flexibility is up to date. So, you know, again, this is the first step. So what is it? Normal extensibility of all soft tissues that allow the complete range of motion of a joint. So basically being able to move through the full range of motion without having any sort of issues that will apply back to you. Okay. Now, what is the purpose of this? You know, again, achieving that, greater amount of extensibility is going to be, basically it's going to be more about that term mobility, okay, which is flexibility plus joint range of motion. So don't assume that flexibility means mobility. They're two separate entities. Flexibility is a component of mobility. So that is the key there. You can be flexible, but, you may not be able to put your joint through full range of motion. You might be flexible and you might not be able to put your joint through a full range of motion. There might be other subtleties that are preventing that from happening, all right? So, that's where we have to make sure that we're well aware of what is going on at that point in time, especially with each one of our people, because every one of us is going to have an individual amount of mobility based on our flexibility. So, these are some of those factors I was kind of hitting on. Genetics, okay? Myofascial tissue elasticity, or like it says here, connective to myofascial, basically that outer perimeter of the muscle for the most part. A composition of the tendons or the skin surrounding the joint. Now, you're like, skin, but yeah, if you have scar tissue, things like that, that can make a big difference. The joint structure, okay, just itself, how yours is made up versus someone else's, like how your scapula is shaped versus another person's, all right? How long is your femur compared to another person's, etc. The strength of the opposing muscle groups can play a difference. Body comp, your gender, age, activity level, previous injuries or other existing medical conditions, and then repetitive movements. Now, with repetitive movements, basically we're just meaning continuous, overload to that's going to be provided, that's going to basically hinder your flexibility. So, poor flexibility can lead to what we would call altered movement patterns, or what we would call relative flexibility. All right. So at that point there, our body really just tries to work along a line of what we would call the path of least resistance. So if our normal path is blunted or it's stopped, then we basically have to understand that in that moment, we are basically not being able to pull with that line of direction. So therefore, what we would have to do is we have to be able to go through and really, it has to be, the body has to change and adapt. So that's why you have new, poorer movements than what we normally would have. All right. So there's two examples here. People who squat. Now, if you start with your feet slightly externally rotated, that could be potentially a proper squat positioning. But if you're squatting and your feet are externally rotated that degree, like this person up here in this top section, with her feet, kind of moving, way out wide, like penguin stance, or when that person is squatting down and that moves in that direction, that's a problem. Same thing down below, where you would have the person who is trying to reach overhead, who is, they're doing an overhead, strict press or shoulder press, whatever you want to call it, military press, and they go into what we would call lumbar extension, or looks like slight lordosis. And that is really, like it says there, decreased sagittal plane shoulder flexion. So therefore, what you end up with is an ability for your arms to move directly overhead. You see that person's shoulders are not stacked correctly. They're a little bit more anterior than they would be, a little bit more neutral. So we have to be aware that the nervous system is not recruiting the right muscles the right way, because the path of least resistance is like basically disrupted in some way. So, we got to be aware that, muscle groups are going to be dictated by, that ability of, that flexibility amount. So if you are not able to have the proper flexibility of very specific muscles, then basically what we're doing is we're not going to have proper body control. Okay. So we have to be able to provide a specific amount of techniques in the right manner so that we can adjust and work with everybody in their own manner to get the right extensibility and in all planes of motion, sagittal, frontal, and transverse. All right. And here's just a couple of examples here, talking about the lats, the biceps femoris, or your very strong, very powerful main hamstring muscle, and then your gastrocnemius, and how all three of them have sagittal, frontal, and transverse plane implications. Okay. Just, three of a few that are like that manner. Okay. So, we have to understand too that with flexibility, the kinetic chain, which we know about muscular system, skeletal system, and nervous system. All right. If any one of those is disrupted through flexibility, it's going to affect the other, which is going to affect the other, which means if the nervous system or if the muscular system is having is off or tight or whatever you want to call it, overactive, then ultimately what's going to happen is that muscular system, the nervous system is not going to allow the muscular system to fire those muscles, because it's like, why? It's not feeling good. And then therefore your skeletal system those joints do not move correctly. So you can see where it can become very, very challenging. So that kinetic chain, we've talked about this a little bit before too. The upper kinetic chain and the lower kinetic chain, shoulder, elbow, wrist, hip, knee, ankle, and foot, basically from pelvis down and then pelvis up. Okay. So, we have our upper and lower kinetic chain, and that can, those kinetic chains can cause certain muscular imbalances, like it says on the right here. All right. Those muscular imbalances can lead to eventual poor posture. Those poor postures lead to horrible movement patterns or improper movement patterns, which eventually lead to an injury of some state. All right. And this is really what we would call postural distortion patterns. When your muscles become imbalanced, they lead to that postural change, which lead to the movement change, which lead to an injury because of that cumulative effect. Okay. So we have to be aware that if we see these imbalances, we have to catch them by doing things like the overhead squat assessment, or the single leg squat assessment, or the push or the pull assessment. This is why we do those, because we see where things are out of whack, out of alignment. Okay. So we have to be aware of that. So static postural distortions and altered movement patterns are what it's going to lead to, and it's not a proper positioning for that. And we have to be aware that at any point in time, this can happen to anybody, whether you're a high-level exerciser or a low-level exerciser. It just doesn't matter. So again, with those muscle imbalances, alterations in length of the muscles surrounding a joint, and if you look in the background of the still shot, in the very background, the faint, there's your muscle balance. You've seen this picture before, blew it up a little bit bigger here, but the muscle imbalance, your shortened muscle on the left side, your lengthened muscle, or your underactive muscle on the right side. And by doing that, that imbalance will lead to improper pulls. So then you end up with these things down here on the bottom. Postural distortions, which we talked about from this slide right here. The imbalances which lead to the injury eventually. That takes time though. Repetitive movements, that cumulative effect. So there's that cumulative trauma because of repetitive movements or that constant overload. Emotional distress. People who carry, you ever heard of people who carry their stress in their neck, or so be it. Poor training technique, just improper movement while training can cause wrong muscles to fire, causing imbalance. Poor bodily control, if people are not walking correctly, even that can make a massive difference in everything. And then a biased training pattern, which basically means here that we our, at that point in time, our bias training patterns, we're really saying to ourselves that we do not want to be able to constantly move in the same repetitive motion over and over again. Okay. So with our muscle imbalances, there we go. There's that cumulative injury cycle, which we don't want to get to. But again, muscle imbalances, those are created based on, like it says there, altered reciprocal inhibition. So altered length tension relationships. We talked about that previously. You're calling upon non-prime movers. There's your synergistic dominance, where the synergists are now taking over. And then arthrokinematic dysfunction, where you're basically saying that your skeletal, your joint system is not moving correctly. Altered neuromuscular control, that point leads to tissue fatigue, and that tissue fatigue leads to the cumulative injury cycle. All right, so we have to be aware of all of those things, because once that injury cycle takes into place, that's that true muscle imbalance. That's where you're, even moving around, you're chronically feeling like you're hurt. So there's your first one, altered reciprocal inhibition, and your second one, synergistic dominance. So reciprocal inhibition is, like it says, simultaneous contraction of an agonist muscle and the relaxation of its antagonist. So if that is altered in any way, what we're saying is that the agonist is overactive, so therefore it's decreasing the neural drive to its functional antagonist to relax it, so therefore it becomes overactive when we don't want it to be. Okay, that's, again, force couple relationships, that's where multiple muscles will keep joint structures intact and keep them from making unwanted movements. That can lead to that poor bodily control, joint dysfunction, not a positive aspect there. Synergistic dominance, all right, more so, we kind of hit on this a little bit before, but it's where the synergists are the now main functioner, when really it's simply because of the fact that the nervous system is like, well, I can't move this muscle in the right way, so therefore I'm going to inhibit or back off on these prime movers, and I'm going to compensate by making the synergist more active at that point. So there's your muscle imbalances we talked about. Arthrokinematic, so, going back there to the second level, arthrokinematic dysfunctions, that's what we're referring to here. Again, motion of the joint. So we're having the dysfunction of a joint movement at that point when we're talking about, with muscle imbalances. So, again, osteokinematic versus arthro. Osteo is how the bones and joints move, where arthro describes how the joint, describes the motion of the joint surface. So like it says there on the top right, you see, we talked about those three earlier. I believe maybe in chapter 6, where the roll, slide, and spin. All right. Roll, slide, and spin are arthrokinematic. Adduction, extension, flexion, whatever joint motion you're talking about is osteokinematic. All right. So how do we prevent, how do we make things work correctly? How do we have a good workaround? Well, you end up with the muscle spindles and the GTOs, which we call proprioceptors. Okay. The first one, the muscle spindle, is exactly where it's found in the muscle. It detects stretch or length or speed of length change. So that's critical for that. So if we're trying to work on, if you were to take someone and move their hamstring and lay them on their back, bend their opposite leg, take their right leg and stretch it straight out. As you start getting up toward the top of that, the muscle spindle will actually kick back on you when you hit that certain stretch point, where basically the muscle is saying, stop, don't go any farther. I don't like this. Okay. So that's where proper tone comes into play. But you hold that, you go back off of where it kicked back from you, hold that for a few seconds, have them contract it against you, PNF, proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, and then you come back down. Or even just general stretching, hold that stretch there for about 10 seconds, come back down, kind of take that person's leg and kind of shake it out a little bit, go back. You should be able to, at that point, move that leg a little bit farther before the muscle spindle is going to cause that contraction again. And that's the main part of the muscle spindles. It's trying to do that repeatedly over and over again. Okay. Whereas the Golgi tendon organs, they're more about tension change, so muscle tension and the speed of that tension. Golgi tendon organs found in the actual tendon itself. Okay. So with flexibility, we're talking about that length, the lengthening action of everything. When the muscles lengthen, there we talk about it, the muscle spindle is activated. So therefore, we say the stretch reflex is activated. So therefore, what happens is when the stretch reflex is activated, you're stretching the right muscle, you're turning off the antagonist at that point. So therefore, the target muscles can be held and contracted in the right manner. At that point there, GTOs are signaled that will override that stretch reflex, and then it'll relax the muscle in that positioning. All right. So even though that tension is being built up, the GTO is like, it's okay. You can lengthen because we're in a better position. Okay. So we want to inhibit that muscle spindle to be able to provide a little bit more flexibility and range of motion as needed. So a little bit more. We talked about that cumulative injury cycle, which has led to, improper flexibility. There's the cumulative injury cycle up on the left. So what we end up with is, something occurs, we end up with tissue trauma, which leads to inflammation, okay? That swelling and that point tenderness. But if you look down here, the normal fibers have knots in them. We call them adhesions. Those adhesions are part of that process where the inflammation leads to muscle spasming or involuntary contractions that aren't needed, which lead to those adhesions. Those adhesions make the muscle move incorrectly. Therefore, it leads to muscle imbalance, and then that cumulative injury cycle keeps progressing. Now you have something that's wrong with you based on this pattern overload, and so you end up having a problem with a constant issue of pain. Now, one of the things that we want to pay attention to, and there probably would be a question based off of your physical test from Nasm, is Davis's law, which revolves around the aspect of your soft tissue will remodel in the line of stress. So again, that inflammation is going to keep happening, that tissue trauma is going to keep happening. Davis's law is your soft tissue is going to want to constantly remodel, but you're constantly hurting muscle fibers. So it really kind of hurts that aspect there. So, we have to be aware that we're trying to avoid all of these things by just being more flexible. So we have different types, okay? So these different types, self-myofascial release, a little more common, it would be called, foam rolling, all right? Static stretching, active stretching, and then dynamic stretching, all right? All of those are part of Nasm's process for trying to achieve this proper flexibility in any way, shape, or form. So self-myofascial release, there's some good examples here, but the person on the left there, what are we doing? We're breaking up adhesions of the fascia, okay, that surround that muscle tissue. And therefore, some of the ways, foam rollers, they can be smooth or they can be smooth or they can have knobs on them. It doesn't really matter. Okay. So that's part of the process there. You can, and then by either one doesn't really, some can provide a little bit different stimulus, others may not. All right. The other thing you can use is, like it says, a handheld stick. Okay. That's, the middle picture that's to the left. And then you can also, like it says there, that's a rumble roller. That's another example of that, is something more on the lines of like a lacrosse ball or a tennis ball or a golf ball. All right, that could be used in those manners as well. And again, what are we doing? We're providing a way to break up this fascia in that manner. Okay. So if, there's the theory behind it, the mechanical part of it is that compression relaxes the tissues. The neurophysiological component of that is that the compression influences tissues to relax, and the pain around it, you'll basically call upon what we call the mechanoreceptors and pain receptors, or nociceptors, and those will kind of shut off so they're not feeling as much of that. So in that moment, you might feel a little bit of that distraction, but at the same time, you may end up with, eventually that releasing of that pain at that point. So there's some examples here of that self-myofascial technique. You can do your calves, you can do your quads, you can do your TFL, lats, peroneals, adductors, piriformis, hamstrings, the lateral thigh, and then the thoracic spine. So, again, 1 to 3 sets, held on that point of tenderness for about 30 seconds. All right, we're trying to make sure that we hold, so you're going to roll and then on those areas, and as soon as you feel that point of tenderness, hold it. So you're going to put the pressure down on it to hold. That's one of the mistakes that a lot of people make, is they don't do the hold. So some precautions, definitely pay attention to these because you will be tested upon them. Any of these would be, so if you pause it here, you can see your exist. There can be other interactions as well that might cause some problems. But understand that for the most part, these are the main precautions here. Varicose veins, sensitivity to pressure, elderly, right, medications that may alter a client's sensation. So all of these make a difference in what you're trying to achieve. So pay attention to these precautions. Contraindications, any skin issues, wounds, osteoporosis, recent surgeries, acute infections. So a lot of these, again, they're going to be more in the moment for people, but make sure that we know what they're up against. Cancer patients, they don't want them doing this because it could cause issues with the compression on those tumor sections. Other ones, connective tissue disorders, pregnancy. Pregnancy is going to be, again, see where it says consult your physician. Pregnant women, again, too much pressure can cause unwanted stimuli within the body, so therefore it could change, it could, potentially lead to early onset pregnancy that we don't really want. All right, but just remember, so consult your physician, always err on the side of caution with a lot of these. So static stretching, the main purpose here, holding the point passively. All right, you're the one that's doing that for a minimum of 30 seconds. We can go longer if we want to. That's not unheard of. But again, down on the bottom there, 1 to 3 sets, hold each stretch for about 30 seconds or longer, right, depending upon toleration and, of course, experience. We don't want new people going, for 2 minutes straight of a hold when they really shouldn't be because their muscles are not in that positioning. All right, so what's the point? The prolonged period of holding is meant to inhibit the muscle spindle, cause that relaxation, kind of let yourself get into that groove of feeling that stretch. All right, now again, we go to discomfort, we don't go to pain. That's the main thing. Discomfort, no pain. Here's some of those stretching areas. Now I'm going to pull up some of the pictures of this at this point, just so we can kind of get a better understanding of, again, gastrocnemius stretch, getting that back foot planted down. All right, that's one of them. Going into our soleus stretch, if you look here, again, trying to shift the weight a little bit, you're getting a little bit more of an angle, all right? But it's very similar to the gastrocnemius stretch in its own right, okay? A static 90-90 hamstring stretch. If you look there, this is where we're using an implement like a band. We can provide, by putting it in the center of the foot there, we can provide a little bit more stimulus to get a little bit more from a mild stretch to a little bit more aggressive stretch. So that can help. All right. Another one, working with, again, supine. This is biceps femoris, where you're going to get your foot to come over a little bit. So again, straight position, working on getting that leg back, but you're going to kick that leg over the midline of the body. But you don't want to rotate the torso. You just want to get the hip to kind of come off the ground a little bit. There's your standing biceps femoris stretch. So you can see here, hands come together, and we work on moving ourselves in a rotational manner with a leg straight out and the toe pointed. More ball adductor stretches. I tried this the other day just because I was kind of confused about it. When I saw the picture, I'm like, does it really work? But it does. You really feel that pull on that. If you look on this person's right leg, that right leg straight, you really do feel that pull on those adductors. Standing adductor, a little bit more like, a lot of times you might hear these called Cossack squats, COSSOCK, and those can be a little bit more ballistic if you wanted them to be or dynamic, because you can go side to side with them. But again, trying to get into that, like basically a lateral lunge, but keep that left leg in this lady's position here or situation, left leg straight, so you feel that come through the center of the thigh, or the center part or the midline of the thigh. Static adductor magnus stretch here, again, very good, very, very good stretch here, where you're getting yourself up onto like a 12-inch plyometric box and reaching down and stretching. Definitely feel that through that whole adductor region. Static TFL, definitely another good one. I use this a lot as well. This person here, the only difference I would say is I see that person has their leg a little bit too much in line. I would just, it is a staggered stance, but I would get that back leg to be kicked over a little bit more lateral so you have a better base of support. And you really get that pull over and feel that through that right leg. That's where you would feel that, is that back leg. Kneeling hip flexor stretches, a lot of times, this is again kneeling, so you're not in motion. But these here, we are working with, we're talking about from this standpoint, no dynamic, but this is kind of the lower section of what we would call a Samson stretch. All right, so again, getting those hip flexors to really engage as needed. Now you could, to make this a little bit more challenging, you can bring that back leg a little bit farther back and get that front leg to be a little bit more stretched. That'll pull a little bit more on the hip flexors themselves. Piriformis, you've seen this before, I'm sure. A lot of times, you've ever heard of the pigeon pose? You can do that in the seated position. Your erectors, working on that rotation, trying to get the spine to twist a little bit to pull and tighten up on the complete spinal area. Static ball lat stretches. The more you drop your head, the more you really get that pull on that lat. Then, again, that doorway stretch, your pec stretch, this is always a good one. Very, very optimal for just releasing of those the pec major minor. Upper trap or scalenes. The difference here, though, if you look at this person, is you want to make sure that this right arm needs to be behind the back as you're pulling in the opposite manner. Okay, so you're still stretching the right side, but you need to use your left arm to stretch it. And then same premise, see this a little bit better picture, arm behind the back, pulling a little bit more to the side, okay, a little bit more lateral, is going to get your levator group. Sternocleidomastoid, you want to tilt that head up and pull backward. You're going to get that front portion of the neck. All right, so these are all really good in terms of your static stretching, okay? So eventually we'll move into the active part, but for now, these are the ones that we kind of went through, but very, very good for what we're trying to achieve here, okay? Definitely trying to work really hard on making sure that we're working everything accordingly and to do those 30-second or more holds. So there was a couple of those options we saw, but we got into a bunch of them as well. Active stretching, on the other hand, there's 1 to 3 sets. What are we doing here? We're holding that end range for about 1 to 2 seconds, okay? That's the main point here, is that we're going into that 1 to 2 second hold, and then we're going to do about 5 to 10 reps. That's the difference there. We're not holding for 30 seconds at the end range. We're more concerned about going through the range of motion, and then at that point there, when we go through that range of motion, we're going to work on 5 to 10 sets with an end range of 1 to 2 seconds. Okay, that's the key there. Motor neuron excitability, and then we're creating that reciprocal inhibition of the muscle that's being stretched. We're turning off the antagonist, turning on the prime mover. Again, a bunch of different areas that we can work with. These are your techniques. So with your, again, like your gastrocnemius and everything like that, if we kind of scrolled through, but we'll go through. There's your soleus. So we're getting a little bit of that, proper foot positioning at that point is optimal, because we need to work on, again, trying to work the back leg, which is technically at this point, the back leg is going to be the critical point for you, because that's the one that is, as you're swinging through, that soleus is contracting in that manner with that flat foot, okay? And also, as you move the motion of the rotation, you're also getting that back foot to be straight up and down, and that's going to help with the calf itself. But then as you take that inversion of the ankle, that's really where you're going to get that motion. Very, very critical for that. Active hamstring stretching here, if you look, now we're just working on flexing and extending the knee. That's the main point there. So that 90-90 stretch, same thing as we did before, but now we're just putting it a little bit more active. Kick it down into that 90-degree position of the knee, kick it back up, controlled, hold for 2 seconds, go back down. So again, 5 to 10 reps, 1 to 2 seconds of hold at the end range. Your active supine biceps femoris stretch, if you noticed here, you're going to go into, again, that if you remember the first picture, all we're working on here is, again, the same thing we just did in that last stretch, except now we're rotated over the midline, in and out 90 degrees, okay? Standing adductor stretch is kind of what I was talking about before, just being in that active sense. So you rotate through, hold for 1 to 2 seconds, stand back tall, and then repeat. So basically what you're doing is you're taking a lot of the previous stretches and you're adding the motion to it and a slight hold and then go from there. So again, there's that adductor stretch with the movement, back to returning and repeat. Active TFL stretch, same thing. Hold, come back down and repeat. All right, so that's going to be the critical component there. Your active kneeling hip flexor stretch is very similar to that, in that manner where, again, you're going to be in that active position and you're going to work with trying to constantly move to and from that positioning so that you stay engaged the whole time, and then return and then do it again. So again, 5 to 10 reps, 1 to 2 seconds held at the last point, okay? And then there's your active lat stretch. That again, pushing that ball out, dropping the head a little bit, pushing it back through. Active pec stretch. So again, basically moving forward slightly with that body and then releasing back through. Okay, that's the key point there. So it's a repeat and then come back to rest. All right, and then again, the upper trap, the scalenes, the levators, again, we're just being a little bit less. We're going to hold 1 to 2 seconds and then repeat. Hold it, 1 to 2 seconds, then repeat. Scalenes, levator scapula, sternocleidomastoid. So again, all of the ones that we did earlier, but just understanding that in that moment, we're just taking that static stretch and making it a hold at the very end for 1 to 2 seconds and then repeat. So we're kind of progressing from a static into like a slight dynamic, but just a little bit different, And there's your dynamic. So we'll kind of hit on that for a little bit here, but we'll pull up some of the options that you can see in a second. But dynamic is going to be full with motion. Now this is going to mimic a lot of what you're going to be doing when you're working out. So, again, dynamic, research-wise, dynamic stretching is very critical because of the fact that it does show to improve performance. And I'm not just talking about sports performance, but just movement performance in general. So dynamic stretching is always optimal before you do any sort of exercise. Static stretching usually beforehand. So rule of thumb, self-myofascial release and dynamic stretching before, self-myofascial release and static stretching post. Active stretching can also be used before as well. Okay? So what is your options here? One set, 10 to 15 repetitions for that particular muscle group, and then 3 to 10 exercises that we can do. Just, again, be more specific to the regions that you're trying to achieve. So prisoner squats, and then move on down from there. A lot of these are going to be very similar to what, you might know of as, generalized movements. Okay, so let's start off at the top. Prisoner squats, basically you want to make sure that you get proper depth here, but using and opening up that chest is going to be really critical for this as well. Okay, really getting that spine in there as well. Different planes of motion lunging. Okay, you can also do lunging with a rotation. Okay, but again, you can either do walking lunges, you can do, walk in place, meaning you step back to start and then go back out. All right, those are just a few of the lunging variations. Tube walking, band walking, whichever way you want to call it, but putting that band, getting those glutes, the glute medius to really fire up on these, or your abductors in particular. Really, really good for a squat day because sometimes we don't realize how much we need those glute medius muscles to be able to function. This is just a general good exercise and, just for general purposes, even if it's not for stretching. Leg swings, always positive. You can do front to back leg swings. You can do side to side leg swings. All right, those are always key as well, making sure you're holding on. Frankensteins, I usually work with opposite arm to opposite leg. They're just using both arms and both legs, while you're walking to and from. So either one is correct, but this one here, they're doing 2, which alleviates the need to do opposites. So, but again, very controlled. High knees, I call these knee tucks. I really call them walk to knee to chest, basically walking knees to chest. And that, again, you're a little bit moving, but you're trying to stay in control, trying to keep yourself as upright as possible. Push-ups with the rotation, I call these push-ups to a T. Okay, you're basically making a T with your body. Ball, Russian twist, a little bit different here, trying to work on a little bit of, trunk rotation, working on those obliques, working on your glutes, particularly your glute maximus. All right, so very, very lightweight ball you need. Arm circles, jumping jacks. You can do different variations of jumping jacks. All right, jump roping is always cool because it's a really good cardio base if you use it correctly, but it's also really good to get the lower limbs to get, the lower body, the legs basically to get warm completely from hip down. So, those are your dynamic stretches, okay? So, really good quality movements. They're definitely worth, again, making sure you pay attention to the areas that are under attack that for your workout that you're going to be doing for that day. So controversial stretches, there's a few of them. Straight leg toe touches, but again, if this is more, take these controversial stretches with a grain of salt, because if you're a person who has already good flexibility, then we can work in these areas. But straight leg toe touches, that's called a saddle position up in the top right, or arching quadriceps. Bottom left there is the hurdler stretch. The one in the middle there, this is what we would call a yoga plow. And then a shoulder stand. A lot of these are compromising because it depends on the person. But again, a lot of these, like a plow in yoga, that's for people who do yoga. A shoulder stand, haven't really seen that a lot lately in terms of that, that dynamic base. So again, a lot of these aren't really used to a full extent anymore. But if you look at the straight leg toe touch, that person is just putting themselves in a compromised position anyway, instead of being, neutral spine, neutral neck, and just trying to follow the line of the leg. So take those for what they're worth. All right. So, flexibility is really key and critical for ourselves, but just make sure that we're paying attention to, the person that we're working with, what we're really having them try to achieve, and what is their ultimate goal, But again, everybody should be doing flexibility. Everybody. Start with 2 to 3 times a day, build up to 5 to 7 times 2 to 3 times per week. With new people is always optimal. 5 to 7 days per week is what you want to build up to, and everybody who is a trainer should be following that same rule. And that's one thing that I lacked a lot when I, during certain times of my, my exercise career, is I just didn't handle it correctly, but I regret that. Not that I'm injured now, but I wish I would have maintained it while I was doing specific things like powerlifting, for example. I neglected it a lot, and really kind of, looking back at now as I do more flexibility work, wish I would have done it when I was younger and a little bit dumber in that way. So, again, just be aware that the flexibility is not something you want to overlook, and you want to just maintain it as best as you possibly can and try to be as mobile as you can as well. So I thank you all for listening. I really do. I really appreciate you taking the time to continue to listen to these. Chapter 13 was the first. Chapter 14 of flexibility is your next standpoint. Moving on to chapter 15, which is your cardio based. All right. So I hope you have a great day, and talk soon.